Hello, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody who finds themselves in between. I'm happy to welcome you at our discussion on this wonderful occasion of the Pride Month that is now going on. We gathered here online today to discuss the challenges that LGBT plus people faced across Europe and how the Russian war against Ukraine has exacerbated these threats. Also, we will also try to come up with the ideas on how the transatlantic community, the transatlantic alliance can work together to bolster democratic values and to protect LGBT people and to LGBT rights. So these are the main topics we are going to cover today. And I just want to let everybody know who is watching us that this event is hosted by the Center for European Policy Analysis. So I want to thank them for doing that and organizing this event and inviting these wonderful guests that I'm going to introduce right now. So we'll have Áron Demeter, Head of Research and Communication at Amnesty International Hungary. We'll have Tamar Oniani, a Human Rights Program Director at Georgian Young Lawyers Association. We'll have Samuel Ritholtz, Max Weber Fellow at European University Institute, and Mikhail Tumasov, who is a member of Russian LGBT Network and right now a board member of Lesben and Schwulenverband organization association, which is in English means Lesbian and Gay Association of Germany. I'm very happy to welcome everybody here at this panel discussion, and I believe it's going to be fruitful and insightful. My name is Sashko Shevchenko. I will be a moderator of today's discussion. I'm a multimedia producer at Radio Free Europe, and in my day-to-day work, I cover human rights issues and particularly the rights of LGBT community in Ukraine. So I want to start our conversation with the challenges that LGBT people face today across Europe. And these experiences vary from country to country. For instance, in Hungary, in last year, Viktor Orbán's government held a referendum that many activists and NGOs called as the one that is anti-LGBT. And I don't want to put any words in the mouth of these organizations as long as we have a representative of Amnesty International here with us today. I want to ask Áron Demeter, what was that referendum about and how the civil society tried to publicly protest against it? What are the results? So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sashko, and great to be here. So I'll talk about the referendum in a minute, but I think to have a clear picture on Hungary and the LGBT rights currently, I have to go back a few years. So if you might let me, I'll just briefly do that. So a couple of years ago, the Hungarian government and representatives of the Hungarian government started to use the LGBTQI community and people belonging to that community as kind of the new scapegoat. Basically, what we've seen at first were statements from the government saying that LGBT people are a threat to children, they are a threat to the so-called traditional form of family and the traditional European way of living. And after a while, they started not just talking about the issue, but actually actively legislating on the issue. So in 2020, they banned legal gender recognition for transgender and intersex people. A few months later, they banned adoption for LGBTI people and single parents, both homosexuals and heterosexuals. And in 2022, they adopted a law which is very similar to the Russian so-called propaganda law in Hungary, basically or effectively banning the so-called portrayal and promotion of homosexuality and gender change in the media and in public education. But that wasn't enough. Hungary had a national election in 2022, so the government decided to amp up its homophobic and transphobic rhetoric. So they organized a referendum, a national referendum, to kind of back up and create support from the society around that law. So basically, we had a national referendum in April 2022, posing 4 questions around the portrayal and promotion of homosexuality to the public. And since it was the same day as the national election, there was a quite well-founded fear that this referendum might be valid and that it would mean that further legislation will come down and further legislation will be adopted against the LGBTQI community in Hungary. So with one of our partners, one of the LGBTI organization partner of Amnesty Hungary, we led a campaign basically invalidating the referendum. So we asked the people to go there and cast an invalid vote at the referendum because the questions were so nonsense that we felt that, people have to show up and people have to publicly demonstrate that they are against this referendum and the questions and the narrative around it. The government dubbed it as a family protection referendum. So the narrative or the framing around the referendum was that LGBTI people are a threat to children because some of them or most of them are actually pedophiles, and I think that will resemble to other countries as well, definitely with Russia. So we decided to run a campaign on values, basically. So instead of talking about how nonsense this framing and this narrative is, we featured LGBTI people and featured their co-workers and parents and friends and family members talking about safety and family and what family means to them. We never said anything about the government's position. What we try to do is to tell people that families comes in many shape and form, and we all want to have our family members in safety. It doesn't matter how your family looks like. And this was a quite unique campaign in Hungary, and at the end we managed to mobilize more than 1.7 million people to cast an invalid ballot. So the referendum turned out to be invalid, which basically so the government didn't have a chance to adopt an even more restrictive legislation on that.
Thank you very much, Áron, for this information and insights on how these threats are visible in Hungary, and how, what is more important, how the civil society and NGOs can work together to, using the democratic tools, try to protest against those, because democracy is the way the society functions, where everyone is respected equally and has equal rights. And as you said, that some of these experiences might be relevant not just for Hungary. These narratives that the conservative groups sometimes use are sometimes similar, and that's why when we speak about these challenges, we cannot ignore the Russian experience, of course, because the country where the elections, for instance, were proved to be manipulated, it's not a big problem, I guess, to manipulate the referendum like the one that happened in Hungary. But does the Russia actually need that kind of referendum? What's the situation in Russia? What can the activists and NGOs do in a society, in Russian society today, especially given that today Russia is waging a very aggressive war, and the laws inside Russia has become even more restrictive. So I'll ask Mikhail Tumasov to join our conversation and tell us more about that. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, which is really, really very tricky. And that answer will be not easy to me, because just recently we spoke with colleagues who stayed in Russia. They're still working on the issue of human rights. They're trying to support the people who still fighting against regime, at least. And nowadays, of course, it's very, very difficult after the Russia launched this absolutely aggressive and bloody war against Ukraine. You should know that even the word war is prohibited in Russia. They are obliged to use another abbreviation to describe the war. Otherwise, they will be labeled as enemy of the state. So that's mostly work of that activists who stayed in Russia. They do it in some way, I would say, partisan way. So they're making some networks. Of course, mostly it's more about like social support people rather than advocacy. That's absolutely impossible to make any kind of advocacy in Russia nowadays. Actually, because there is none who will be listening to you, and no international laws, no international declaration are valid for the regime. And the worst situation that Russia is spreading this practice, not just among its population, but also among other populations. For example, even inside of Russia, there's some media, central media, federal media, which is ruled by the state, where they show when they invade one Ukrainian city, they show that the office of LGBT organization, local Ukrainian LGBT organization, and they say that it's a place where LGBTI people, which supported by Biden personally, that was literally said in mass media. And also they show a kind of pillow with a Satan image to show that LGBT and anti-Christianity and American are connected in combo. So that is simple people could see through the federal channels. And I would say other ways which Russia also influenced other countries, it's a political way, some economical way. You see I think that, of course, Tamar will say about it more deeply, but definitely Russia is trying to influence Georgian government through economical pressure as well, unfortunately. And of course, historical ways, like it's done with Serbia, for example, some Hungary, etc. Just yesterday, you can see that pro-Russian party made sabotage in Sofia Pride. So that is the way we live and work, but still we have some hope. And I think that partisan way, which is now just constructing, because we never been in such situation, it's in our aim, and we still think that we can manage it and save people and go on with human rights fighting in even such areas as Russia.
Thank you very much, Mikhail, for the insights about Russia and what is going on inside the country, and also its impact on the neighboring countries, and not only countries that neighbor Russia, but even further. In a moment, I will turn to our next speaker, but having this opportunity, I just also want to add some context about how the war that Russia started more than a year ago against Ukraine affected Ukraine, and in particular LGBT people, that actually, given all the negative outcomes, kind of triggered the legislation which is more LGBT friendly in Ukraine. That's what we report at RFURL in our articles and shows, that some of the initiatives moved from being on standby, and that also comes to civil partnership legislation, because the war and the couples that when one partner goes to war and his or hers, their partner stays back home and they are an LGBT couple, they are very much deprived of many rights that families have in Ukraine. So that kind of triggered a discussion within the Ukrainian society whether it is time to legalize the civil partnerships and give more rights to LGBT people. That's also one of the outcomes and impacts of the war that started a year ago. But now I want to give the floor to our next speaker, to Tamar Oniani, and ask her about the Georgian experience. Mikhail has already touched on that there are some external actors that play here, but I also want to ask you to touch on how the Georgian government kind of behaves in its Euro integration aspirations, given that trying to become a EU member means obeying European laws. How is the situation with that in Georgia?
Hello, thank you first of all for inviting to this very important and interesting discussion. Starting from the Georgia's EU integration path, actually, this is very related to the topic that we are exploring, because ensuring the equality rights is one from the 12th of priority framed by the European Commission for Georgia. And first of all, what I want to stress is the fact that the Georgian people has many times demonstrated that their values and their aspirations are clearly pro-European, and also our constitution guarantees that the Georgians' foreign policy should be European. But what we now need to explore is the current developments on the national level. And unfortunately, I don't have exciting news to say in that respect, because what we witnessed is clearly the reiteration of the history that happened in Russia since 2012, when, first of all, the foreign agents law was initiated, when, for example, the so-called propaganda law was initiated, etc. In February this year, the draft laws on foreign agents has been initiated in the parliament, but as a result of this sparked massive protest in the streets, the government had to withdraw these bills, and fortunately they are clearly withdrawn as of now. But we don't think that this is enough, because on the everyday basis, we see the clear threats, and we see that the damage is being done on the everyday basis by the governmental officials. And this also has some expressions in respect with the anti-LGBTQI rhetorics from the high-level officials. And now coming back to this issue, under the EU recommendations and priorities, also it was one of the obligations for the state to ensure that impunity for the hate crimes is no longer the issue on the national level. And we have witnessed a number of cases won by applicants against Georgia and Strasbourg court. But recently, last year, we clearly read the statement from the Strasbourg judgment saying that the impunity for the past experiences is one of the major cause for new circumstances to happen. And that is what we see, because the LGBTQI community is clearly restricted on the practical level to realize their peaceful demonstration rights. And they have to hold all the events that they intend to hold in the closed facilities, because there exists clearly hate groups, and we can label them as the hate groups, which are related to Kremlin. They have their political party registered, and they are actually the ones who were the organizers of the 5th of July violence against LGBTQI community and against media representatives in Georgia in 2021. And the open source evidence witnesses this and proves this, and it was the sentence from the public defender office to the prosecutor to also introduce charges against them, but none of the organizers are punished. This leads us to the problem that there also exist challenges on the institutional level, because all these cases in Strasbourg, all of them had the same problem, the ineffectiveness of the investigation. So that is why the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe has on numerous occasions urged the Georgian authorities to establish the special investigative unit within the Ministry of Interior Affairs, which is not as of now fulfilled. And another issue that is clearly a problem is the rhetorics from the high-level officials, because their statements have the way encouraging effect on the society. So it is about the content of the statement, whether it is about the tolerance or whether it is about to spread the hate. So in this respect, there also exists the clear findings from the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers that urge the Georgian high-level officials to have the statements encouraging the tolerance. But what we see clearly is the rhetoric that is against it. There is anti-LGBTQI community, and it was very rightly mentioned by the previous speakers that the LGBTQI community is becoming some kind of a scapegoats and under this overarching trend to shrink the individual rights or to have these pseudo conservative values that are actually against the human rights, and not only against the concrete community, but in general human rights. And this is also directly related to the foreign policy issue, because there exists a very clear, very obvious similarity to the Russian laws and between the draft laws that are initiated on the national level by the hate groups or the statements that are being spread by the high-level officials. So this is briefly what I can say about the Georgian experience in that respect.
Thank you very much, Tamar, for sharing your knowledge and sharing the specifics how the fight for LGBT rights goes on in Georgia. We have already heard of 3 different experiences from different European countries, and we have found the similarities, and we have as well found the external actors like Russia, for instance, can influence these processes within other countries. So, having discovered that, I want to ask our next speaker, Samuel Ritholtz, to share his insights on how the Russian war has affected the fight for LGBT rights in Europe in general, across the entire continent, whether there are some very similar principles we should focus on today in order to understand how to face these challenges. Samuel, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me. I want to take a moment just to acknowledge the amazing speakers that I'm speaking with on this panel, who are all frontline defenders, activists, lawyers, working at great risks to themselves and their families, which is something that as an academic, I'm not nearly as subject to. So I want to just value and hold space for these efforts by them and their colleagues, which are truly inspirational given the odds. I think that to answer this question, it actually makes sense to go earlier, before the actual war in Ukraine, about a year and 3 months ago, or a year 4 months ago, where when we're talking about these trends, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Georgia, whether it's Russia, there's obviously similarities, there's these patterns. And I think some of this playbook did originate in Russia, this politicizing of quotidian LGBT experience, quotidian or daily LGBT life, And it goes, it starts in Russia, but it happens in other places as well. I mean, you're seeing this in Latin America, you're seeing this in the United States, and you're seeing this elsewhere, beyond Central and Eastern Europe, but also in Southern and Western Europe. And what I think is interesting here to highlight and to kind of think about in terms of frames of resistance, if you will, would probably be 3 points, which I think relate to the war by Russia and Ukraine, but as well as other growing trends. The first is what I call this politicization of hard-fought wins, or hard-fought gains. And that is, after years of this perceived, march of progress as it relates to LGBT populations in Europe and, outside of Europe, there has been a lot of kind of reopening of previous conversations as they relate to LGBT rights. What does LGBT rights mean in terms of the family? What does it mean in terms of the child? This nameless child that is always being mentioned. These frames of what you call them scapegoating, or basically tactics to legitimize the illegalization or criminalization of certain types of behaviors that are often associated with LGBT people. And so this politicization of basically fights and debates where there weren't debates or fights 5 years ago is something that happens perhaps in the civil space, in the social space, but it's something that government rhetoric really maximizes and can exacerbate. And that's what you're seeing in Russia. When it came to multiple times Vladimir Putin justifying the war in Ukraine, he used frames of gender ideology, frames of anti-LGBT rhetoric as a justification for engaging in this type of behavior. And so there you see almost that nexus of what's happening in social spaces, what's happening in civil society, being used as a reason or justification for violent behavior or war itself in the case of Russia or in this political space. But that is something that extends beyond just the war in Russia. I mean, it's something that probably the 3 people that are on this panel with me would all talk about in their own domestic contexts of where they've seen this happen. And that's relates to the 2 other trends that I think we're seeing here, which is this growing illiberalism, which is these ideas, these liberal values that existed. And this is lowercase liberal, not necessarily defined as a political movement, but this idea of one's freedom to express themselves, one's freedom to engage in certain insaliable rights. These rights that come from just being a human being, seeing that be clamped down in both from an LGBT perspective, but from a broader perspective. So these bills that are being used to try and criminalize protest, to criminalize civil freedom of expression. These are things that relate very much to LGBT populations, but they also relate to the broader population. And so it's something to think about in terms of looking at how these struggles are interconnected or intersected, that what happens in one space can very much have a secondary impact, and it can impact people in different ways, depending on the different ways that it intersects with your identity. And the last thing I'll say on this point before getting to talk about perhaps a little bit more about Ukraine is the transnational nature of this struggle and the transnational nature of this issue, really, which is that we're seeing not only trends in terms of patterns, but we're seeing a lot of interconnection in terms of where do these groups start working together behind the scenes? Where is it obvious? Where is it less obvious? So there's already been mentions about how the Russian government's working with certain groups or pro-Russian groups, whether it's Hungary, whether it's Serbia, whether it's Georgia, to try and push forward some of this illiberal legislation or illiberal policy. But there are also non-state actors very much working on this. And there's groups that follow this quite closely. Open Democracy is an organization that's one of them, where they basically follow these illiberal or anti-LGBT rights groups, civil society organizations, religious organizations that behind the scenes are putting forward these types of campaigns, that are moving to fund these campaigns, and to really recognize and reconcile with the fact that a lot of these things might seem like they're popping up disparately in different countries, but they're actually extremely interconnected. And so it's to say that the issues are interconnected. What happens in one space relates to another, but it's also the causes are very interconnected, whether we're talking about its certain involvement with the Russian government or whether it is broader civil society organizations. And to conclude, basically what we can understand with what's happening in Ukraine today and how this relates to the state of LGBT rights in Ukraine, but also in Europe, is I guess 3 quick points. The first is what we're seeing here is this rhetoric. And that rhetoric can be used as a very legitimizing frame for violent intervention. So I already mentioned how Vladimir Putin used this type of anti-LGBT rhetoric to justify the war in Ukraine. But this is something that happens in other spaces as well, where certain types of frames to protect the family or to protect the child or to securitize and frame LGBT people as threats become reasons or rhetorical instruments to justify violent coercive behavior. The second thing is that, you know, it's a broad observation that war exacerbates a lot of social inequalities that are already there. And so when you have an issue, when you have a country at war, when you have existent homophobia, existent patriarchy, existent norms that go against LGBT populations in situations of crisis are going to have to navigate these norms, often in a more intense way. Sorry, there's a thunderstorm happening outside. I hope you can hear me okay. And so with these norms and with these stresses, it just means that certain types of things happen with LGBT populations that exacerbate their vulnerability. So in Ukraine, what some of my research has shown, but in talking with colleagues who are a lot closer on the ground, is that certain types of experiences make it more difficult to navigate the politics of living in a war zone, you know, being trans in a war zone, being disabled in a war zone. All of these things make it a lot more complicated to go about your daily life, to find security, to navigate. You know, we've already mentioned about spousal benefits or what happens when your partner's away at war. And so these are things that basically recognize the vulnerabilities that are produced in a society that's the stress through conflict. And the final point I'll say is that, you know, with war comes migration, it comes displacement. And so now there are, I don't know the current numbers of how many Ukrainians there are throughout Europe and how many of them are LGBT. And LGBT migrants have unique vulnerabilities. They are not able to access certain resources in the same way. They might feel uncomfortable accessing certain shelters. They might not worry that the shelter that they would like to have access to corresponds to their gender identity. And so all these things are just to recognize that these experiences are extremely framed through one's identities. And the stress of displacement, the stress of conflict means that one's vulnerabilities will be exacerbated. And so it's important to kind of think about not only what this means in terms of a response, but also to think about difference and how we can reconcile these differences. You know, we say LGBT, it's an acronym with a lot of different identities who have a lot of different experiences. What happens to a lesbian Ukrainian woman will be very different than happens to a gay Ukrainian male. And so things like that are things that should be reconciled with and thought of.
Thank you very much, Samuel, for such a very broad but very specific and detailed outline of the challenges that stand in front of the LGBT plus community and also allies who try to fight for the rights of people they love, maybe, and the people who they want to live in the same society where everyone feels comfortable. So thank you for that. I just want to really add here that those challenges faced by the Ukrainian LGBT people today have really kind of enhanced and probably even changed. There is a lot of debate on that, and I'm very sorry that we have not enough time to talk about all of them, but that's a very good start, that the discussion that we have here today. I just want to say that the Pride Month actually originated in the US, and I've just come back from the US, and I've seen so many LGBT pride flags on all the businesses, and as well as heard many hateful comments about those flags. So that we can see that American society is also divided on that, but we can see a strong support from the current US government to fight for the LGBT rights. At least we could see the White House being on rainbow colors. So having said that, I want to turn our discussion to the ways that the transatlantic community, not just in the Europe, but also in the Americas, not just the northern, but also the southern Americas, can work together. What can be the main core principles here that can help the societies on both sides of the Atlantic protect the LGBT rights. I'm gonna ask you the same question. What are your insights and thoughts on that? How the Transatlantic Alliance can work together? And I want to ask you to be brief if possible. So we'll start with Áron again. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief. So I think we kind of established that there are patterns, and it's definitely there are a lot of links, and it doesn't really matter where the location that we are talking about. So I think the solution and the kind of or my proposed solution should be also interconnected and should be done pretty much by all of us. So I think the human rights community, and when I say human rights community, I talk about a broad coalition of different organizations and activists and people invested in this sphere. We got it wrong for so many years and for so many decades, from a sense that we thought that it is enough that we are right. So that it is enough that we have the international legal documents, we have different mechanisms, both at regional, both at national, and both at global level. But what we see is that because of this utilization of values like family and safety and protection and prosperity and fairness by the populist governments, we kind of lost these words. So I think we have to acknowledge that communicating their values and communicating the word that they believe in or the word they want to live in, usually populist governments are doing a much better job than human rights organizations. So I think one lesson to be learned is that we have to invest a lot more in research around values. Because I think this fight will not be won with facts. I don't think that myth-busting, what the human rights community has been doing for several decades, is actually really working. Don't get me wrong, we need the facts, and we need the researches, and we need the analysis. But convincing people and engaging people, that's more about the values and talk about the kind of the world that we want to live in. So in that sense, I think we have to be more appealing when we are talking about what kind of world we envisage and what needs to be done to get there. And I think that's one of the key lessons from the last couple of years, definitely, and not just around LGBTI rights and the situation of LGBTI rights, but also refugees, asylum seekers, Roma, women, name it. So all the vulnerable groups has the same problem. So my advice, and I'll try not to be the cheap version of Timothy Snyder, I think we have to reclaim those words like family and fairness and security, because currently these words are possessed by the populist government, and they are actually using against us and the communities that we are trying to protect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Áron. So I'll note down the idea of trying to win the fight back for the notions of family and traditional values. If we speak about those two, I'm afraid to tell you that we really have not enough time. So I want you to be brief. Mikhail, can you add?
Yes, I would say we as a civil society should be less comfortable. We have to be more proactive, looking at the history we live in. And also I would call ourselves to look inside of our organizations we work with. If we follow the values of human rights, we should start with ourselves first.
Thank you very much. And now the floor goes to Tamar Oniani.
I strongly believe in a statement that the violation in one part of the world is felt everywhere. And actually the current events all around the world ensure that the illiberal democracies and the trends and the patterns are very similar. So this is the avenue, I think, that the transatlantic communities can collaborate very well. The civil society collaboration between from the different contexts are very important, because that is how the new ideas are born. And what I think is essential to strive for are the strong institutions, because no research, like no advocacy, will ever be practical if we do not have the strong institutions actually guaranteeing the practical implementation of all the rights that we strive to maintain.
Thank you very much. It's a very valid point when we discuss the human rights issues, especially for the young democracies and especially for the post-Soviet countries that have only started building their institutions. That's a very important point. And now to Samuel, please tell us what your additional thoughts on that are. How can the Transatlantic Alliance work better to protect LGBT plus rights?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said by my co-panelists. I think it's really important to always speak out, and that comes from the highest members of society or most visible to the lowest, that communication is key, to call out abuse, call out injustice. I think communication, the alliance meaning communication between organizations or between activists, between groups, successful efforts in one country as a way to learn about what's happened or how to prevent something in another. I mean, that successful case from Hungary, successful case of activists in Georgia that's been documented. Costa Rica had a massive movement against LGBT, against a candidate, against an anti-LGBT candidate that was running for office, for president. So how, again, groups have responded to this backlash successfully is vital. And the last thing is just to continue to elevate those on the ground doing the work. So, you know, those working at national organizations or international organizations looking to connect in these countries, rather than going towards another big INGO or IOO, look towards the local organization that's doing the work on the ground and bring them up and really embolden them. And that's been very vital in Ukraine, and it will continue to be vital in countries like Russia, Hungary, and Georgia.
Thank you very much, Samuel, and thank you very much to all the panelists. I believe it has proved to be a very fruitful and interesting discussion. So let me just briefly sum up what the conclusions we came up here. So the panelists who joined us today agreed that it is important to not to forget about the words and the true choice of words and the values, but also not to forget about the facts when we're talking about the LGBT communities. It is also important to stand for the values if someone is a representative of an NGO and who is an activist, to all be responsible and to correspond to those values they stand for. It is also important, as we discussed today, to build strong institutions because those institutions are actually the most efficient way, and probably in some cases the only way, to protect the rights of the vulnerable communities, not just the LGBT communities, but the LGBT plus people in particular. And it's also important to look to the neighbors, to see the experiences of other countries, to find good examples and to apply those examples, not to make the same mistakes, but also to repeat successful stories. I believe that the things we discussed today is only a start to understanding how to enhance the fight for the LGBT plus community, because even though a lot of things have been already achieved, there's so many things to work on, especially within the societies, and fight the homophobia within the societies. I'm very thankful to all the panelists who joined us today. And as a closing remark, I want to say that everyone who viewed us today, I want to thank you for turning in for this conversation on LGBT plus rights and the Transatlantic Alliance that can work together to enhance this fight. I want to remind you that this event was hosted by Center for European Policy Analysis. So again, very huge thank you for this organization to organizing this event, inviting amazing speakers, and for the ability to discuss the LGBT plus rights. I want to remind you that if you want to follow Central European Policy Analysis and social media accounts, please visit the website cepa.org, and you will find all the latest analysis, all the latest discussions, and also follow the upcoming events. So please do, and you will be updated on this extremely important analysis of policies that are relevant for Europe as well as transatlantic alliance. My name is Sashko Shevchenko. Thank you very much for everyone who joined us today. And just to remind you who was here with us today. So today we heard from Áron Demeter, Head of Research and Communication at Amnesty International Hungary, from Tamar Oniani, a Human Rights Program Director at Georgian Young Lawyers Association. We also heard from Samuel Ritholtz, Max Weber Fellow at European University Institute, and from Mikhail Tumasov, the member of Russian LGBT Network and a board member at Lesben and Schwulenverband organization in Germany. Thanks again and have a nice day. Goodbye.